Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something we all think about, but rarely in this much detail. We're journeying back to ancient Rome to explore one of the most remarkable and intricate aspects of their civilization, how they said goodbye. This isn't just a story about tombs and processions, it's a story about family, about legacy, about fear, and about the deeply human need to make sure you weren't simply forgotten the moment you were gone. It's about the incredible resilience and ingenuity people had in the face of one of life's great, universal certainties. As always, if you enjoy what we do here, a like or a subscribe is always so appreciated, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's just a quiet way of letting me know that these late-night stories are finding a home. I'm always curious to see where you all are listening from, so feel free to leave a comment saying hello and where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. It's kind of wonderful to think of us all, scattered across the globe, settling in for the same story. Now, let's get you properly comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, pull up the blankets, find that perfect cool spot on the pillow, take a slow, deep breath, and let the day just dissolve. Our only job for the next little while is to drift. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. Whispers from the Underworld. The Roman Philosophy of Death. To understand why a Roman funeral could become one of the most lavish, expensive and theatrical events of a person's life or afterlife, I suppose we first have to understand what they thought they were dealing with. We have to start with the fundamental question: what, to a Roman, actually happened when you died? And the answer, perhaps frustratingly for us, is it's complicated. Unlike some other ancient cultures with a single, state-mandated, user-friendly guide to the great beyond, the Romans had what you might politely call a spiritual buffet. Their vision of the afterlife was a messy, evolving, and often contradictory tapestry woven from 100 different threads. They borrowed from the Greeks, they inherited ideas from the mysterious Etruscans who came before them, and they mixed it all with their own native ancient Italic beliefs about ancestor spirits and household gods. There was no single Roman Bible, no one definitive text that laid it all out. What you believed about death often depended on who you asked, what social class you were in, and which philosopher was currently in vogue. It was less a rigid doctrine and more of a pervasive cultural mood, a shared set of anxieties and hopes that coloured everything. So let's start with the basics. The very moment of death, when a Roman took their final breath, they believed something quite literally left the body. This was the anima. It's a word that's a close cousin to the Greek animars, meaning wind. The anima was the life breath, the vital spark, the animating principle that made a lump of flesh a living, breathing person. It wasn't really the personality or the intellect, that was the animas. The anima was more primal. It was the whisper of air that escaped your lips for the last time. It was a puff of smoke, a fleeting warmth that vanished into the air, simple, elegant, and beautifully, terrifyingly intangible. And once that little puff of anima was out, it became something else. It transformed into a shade, a spirit, an echo of the person it once was. The most common and perhaps the most important term for these spirits was the manes. You would see this word carved on countless Roman tombs, daimanes, dedicated to the spirit gods. The manes were, in theory, the good ones. They were the collective spirits of the ancestors, the family members who had gone before. They weren't exactly angels, and they weren't exactly ghosts in our modern spooky sense. They were more like a kind of spiritual background radiation, a constant, unseen presence. They were the silent, watchful members of the extended family, residing in the underworld, but still deeply connected to the world of the living. Your duty, as a living Roman, was to keep the manes happy. You had to appease them, honour them, and most importantly, remember them. This was done through regular rituals, offerings of food and wine at their tombs on specific holidays, and simply by living an honourable life that brought credit to the family name. If you did your part, the manes were generally benevolent, or at least neutral. They were the ghostly neighbourhood watch, content to stay in their realm as long as they received their due respect. They were family, after all, and like any family, they just wanted to know you hadn't forgotten about them. But where did these manes actually live? What was the geography of the Roman underworld? Again, it was a blurry map. The most popular image, borrowed heavily from the Greeks, was a vast subterranean realm. Sometimes it was called Orcus, a gloomy, shadowy place ruled by a grim god of the same name, who was later syncretized with the Greek Hades and Roman Pluto. This wasn't a place of fiery punishment for the average person. It was just grey, a world of twilight, populated by silent, fluttering shades who had no memory, no passion, no real consciousness. They were like dream figures, faint copies of their living selves, engaged in a pointless, eternal, and deeply boring existence. Virgil describes them in the Aeneid as a crowd of insubstantial spirits, flitting shapes, rustling like dry leaves. Think of it less as a hell, and more as a kind of cosmic waiting room with no magazines and no one to talk to forever. It was a profoundly depressing vision of eternity, a place where your identity, your loves, your achievements were all washed away into a uniform, joyless grey. For a culture as obsessed with fame, glory, and personal achievement as the Romans, this was a truly chilling prospect. The ultimate defeat wasn't death itself, but the utter annihilation of the self that came after. But there were other options on the menu. Also from the Greeks came the idea of the Elysian Fields, a paradise reserved for the truly exceptional. Here, the great heroes, the righteous, and the divinely favoured could spend eternity in a sunlit meadow, enjoying blissful leisure. It was the VIP lounge of the afterlife. But for the average Roman citizen, the shopkeeper, the farmer, the soldier, Elysium felt impossibly distant. It wasn't a reward for just being a decent person. It was a prize for being a legend. And of course there was Tartarus, the deep pit of torment reserved for those who had committed truly heinous crimes against the gods and the state. This was the maximum security prison of the Underworld, a place of active, eternal punishment. But again, this was for the worst of the worst. The titans who rebelled against Jupiter, the kings who betrayed their people. Your average Roman criminal wasn't going to Tartarus. They were just going to the same grey, boring waiting room as everyone else. So you have this vague landscape, a dreary default setting, an almost unattainable paradise, and a terrifying dungeon for mythical villains. For most people, the outlook was bleak. The best you could really hope for was to become a peaceful, respected man's, remembered by your family, and left to rest in the quiet gloom. And this is where the funeral rites become absolutely non-negotiably critical, because all of this becoming a peaceful man's, reaching your designated spot in the underworld, avoiding a terrible fate, was entirely dependent on one thing: a proper burial. This wasn't just a social custom. It was a sacred, ironclad rule with terrifying consequences. A body that was not properly buried, whose funeral rites were not correctly performed, could not cross the river Styx. Its anima, its spirit, was trapped, stuck between worlds. It couldn't find rest in the underworld, and it couldn't fully return to the land of the living. It became a lost, wretched, and increasingly angry thing. And this is where we meet the darker side of the Roman spirit world. If a peaceful, honoured spirit was a man's, a restless, malevolent spirit was a lava or a lemur. These were not the friendly ancestral spirits you left a cookie for. These were deeply unpleasant houseguests from beyond the grave. The larvae were spirits of the wicked, or those who had met a violent end, but most terrifyingly, they were also what became of the unburied. They were hungry, tormented, and filled with a bitter envy for the living. They were said to drive people mad, to drain their life force, to appear as terrifying apparitions. They were the universe's most persistent and depressing telemarketers, calling from the void to whisper horrors into your ear. The lemurs were similar, often used interchangeably, but sometimes described more as generic, frightening spectres. They were the things that went bump in the night, the source of that cold spot in the hallway, the inexplicable feeling of being watched. The Romans even had a specific festival, the Lemuria, held in May, where the head of the household had to perform a special ritual to exorcise these spirits from his home. He would walk through the house at midnight, barefoot, spitting black beans over his shoulder, and chanting 9 times, "With these beans I redeem me and mine," without looking back. It was a ritual of deep, primal fear, an annual spiritual pest control to drive out the miserable spirits that might have accumulated. The fear of becoming one of these things was profound, and the fear of having one attach itself to your family was just as real. An unburied relative wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a public menace, a ticking time bomb of spiritual pollution. Their ghost would wander, weeping and gnashing its teeth, haunting its old home, tormenting the relatives who had failed in their sacred duty. It was the ultimate family shame. It meant you had failed your ancestor at the most fundamental level, and now you and your entire community might pay the price. So the pressure to provide a proper burial was immense. It was a sacred contract between the living and the dead. The living provided the rites, the tomb, and the remembrance. In return, the dead agreed to stay put in the underworld and not come back to cause trouble. It was a transaction, a cosmic exchange of services. "We will give you a nice home and visit you on holidays," the living said. "And you, in turn, will not rattle the pots and pans or give the children nightmares." This brings us to the second, and perhaps even deeper, Roman fear of death. It wasn't just the fear of becoming a terrifying ghost, it was the fear of being forgotten. In a world before photography, before video, before the internet, a person's memory was a fragile thing. It existed only in the minds of those who knew them, and in the physical monuments they left behind. To a Roman, to have your name erased, to be forgotten by your descendants, was to die a second time. This was damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, a punishment the Senate sometimes inflicted on hated emperors, chiseling their names from monuments and destroying their statues. It was considered a fate worse than any execution, because if your anima in the underworld was just a faint, witless copy of you, then your true immortality lay here, on earth. It lay in your name, your reputation, your dignitas. Your legacy was everything. It was the only part of you that could truly survive. And that legacy was maintained, first and foremost, by your funeral. The funeral wasn't just a disposal of the body. It was the final and most powerful statement about who you were. It was a press release to the world and to posterity. The size of the procession, the number of mourners you could hire, the grandeur of your eulogy, the quality of the musicians, the expense of the pyre or the sarcophagus, all of it was a meticulously crafted advertisement for your importance. It was the last best chance to cement your status in the collective memory of Rome. This is why families would bankrupt themselves to put on a good funeral. It wasn't just about love or grief, though that was certainly part of it. It was about duty. It was about ensuring that great-uncle Tiberius would be remembered as a man of substance, and in doing so, ensuring that he would rest peacefully and not come back to complain about the quality of his send-off. This obsession with status and memory extended directly to the tomb itself. Roman roads were famously lined with tombs, from simple markers to enormous elaborate mausoleums. They weren't tucked away in quiet, secluded cemeteries. They were placed along the busiest thoroughfares, the Appian Way being the most famous example. And this was intentional. A tomb was not a place for quiet contemplation. It was a billboard. Every person who walked or rode past that tomb would see the name. They would read the inscription detailing the deceased's accomplishments. Here lies Gaius Julius Valerius, veteran of the 5th Legion, a dutiful father, a loyal friend. The tomb was an active agent, working day and night to keep the memory of the deceased alive. It was a stone guardian against the terrifying silence of oblivion. Some inscriptions even directly addressed the traveller, saying, "Stop, traveller, and read," a desperate plea from the past to be acknowledged, to be remembered, just for a moment. This belief system created a clear hierarchy in death that mirrored the hierarchy of life. If you were a wealthy aristocrat from an old family, your death was a major public event. Your funeral procession would be a grand parade through the forum. Actors wearing wax masks, the imagines of your illustrious ancestors, would march along, a ghostly reunion of the family's greatest hits. Your eulogy would be delivered from the rostra, the same speaker's platform where laws were made and triumphs were celebrated. Your tomb would be a magnificent structure on a prime piece of real estate. Your afterlife was, in a sense, secure. You had the resources to ensure you would be well buried and well remembered. But what if you were a poor plebeian, a day labourer, a fishmonger, a slave? Your reality was very different. You couldn't afford a grand procession or a roadside mausoleum. Your family might struggle just to pay for the cremation and the proper rites. This is why so many poorer Romans joined burial societies called collegia. These were like social clubs with a very specific, very morbid purpose. Members would pay monthly dues, and when one of them died, the collegium would use the collective funds to ensure they received a proper, dignified burial. They would pay for the Undertaker, the cremation, and a niche for the ashes in a shared tomb, a columbarium. These columbaria were fascinating structures, vast underground chambers lined from floor to ceiling, with hundreds of small niches, each holding an urn. They were like apartment buildings for the dead. The collegia were about more than just finances. They were a substitute family. They guaranteed that someone would mourn you, that someone would perform the necessary rites, that your name would be inscribed on a small plaque. They ensured you wouldn't be forgotten, that you wouldn't become a lost and wandering larva. For people with little status in life, these societies offered the profound comfort of knowing they wouldn't be completely erased in death. It was a small but vital claim on immortality. So, as we begin to pull back the curtain on the bizarre and lavish world of Roman funerals, This is the foundation we must stand on. We are looking at a society animated by a deep and layered philosophy of death. It was a philosophy of profound uncertainty. No one was really sure what the afterlife would be like, but the prevailing view was that it probably wasn't great. It was a philosophy steeped in a contractual relationship with the dead. You do your duty by them, and they, in turn, do their duty by staying dead. It was a philosophy haunted by a primal fear of restless spirits, the miserable ghosts of the unburied and the unremembered, who could seep through the cracks of the world and bring misery to the living. And, above all, it was a philosophy consumed by the terror of the second death, the death of memory. The Romans fought against this terror with every tool they had, with stone, with ceremony, with spectacle, and with a desperate, deeply human hope that if they just put on a good enough show, if they just carved their name deep enough, they might just manage to leave an echo of themselves behind. An echo that could withstand the relentless erosion of time. All the incredible rituals we are about to explore were born from this single powerful impulse. Do not forget me. Chapter 2. The Final Breath. Rituals at the deathbed and in the home. And so that great universal fear of being forgotten, of becoming a name without a story, animates everything that is to follow. The grand procession through the streets, the dramatic speeches in the forum, the towering tombs lining the Appian Way. It all begins, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It begins in a quiet room, with a flickering oil lamp casting long shadows on the wall, as a family gathers to witness the precise moment where life becomes memory. The Roman fight against oblivion started here, in the most intimate and vulnerable of spaces, the deathbed. For the Romans, particularly within a family of means, the end was not a solitary affair, it was a communal experience, a final fragile piece of theatre. As a person's life ebbed away, their closest kin would draw near, not just to offer comfort, but to perform a duty of profound significance. The eldest son, or the nearest available relative, would lean in close, pressing their lips to the mouth of the dying. This wasn't a final sentimental kiss as we might imagine it. This was a ritual act. They were there to inhale, to quite literally capture the final breath as it departed the body. To the Roman mind, life was synonymous with breath, the spiritus. It was the animating force, the warm essence of the soul. To let that last puff of air dissipate into the room was to let the spirit wander, to lose it forever. By inhaling it, the relative was performing a sacred act of inheritance. They were taking the essence, the spirit, and the lineage of the departed into themselves. It was a promise that the vital spark of that person would not be extinguished, but would instead be carried forward, mingled with the breath of the living. It was the first, most personal, and most powerful act in the long war against being forgotten. The spirit of the father would now live, quite literally, in the lungs of the son. The moment that final breath was drawn in, and the body lay still, a new sound would erupt in the quiet room. It was the conclamatio. This was not the gentle weeping of grief, but a sudden loud and ritualized shouting. The family members, one by one, would begin to call out the name of the deceased, over and over and over. Lucius, Lucius, Lucius. The sound would fill the house, a stark and startling contrast to the silence that had just fallen. This had a practical, if slightly morbid, purpose. In an age before stethoscopes and EEG machines, confirming death was not an exact science. The terrifying possibility of being buried alive was a very real background hum of anxiety. The conclamatio was, in part, a final desperate check. Perhaps the person was not truly gone, but merely in a deep coma, a state of suspended animation. Maybe, just maybe, the sound of their own name being called with such force and urgency could jolt them back to the world of the living. It was the ancient world's equivalent of frantically checking for a pulse, but with a lot more volume and coordinated effort. But it was also more than that. Once it became clear that no response was coming, the continued calling of the name served a new function. It was the official declaration. The repeated, unanswered name was the formal announcement to the household gods, the Lares and Penates, and to the universe itself, that this person was now truly gone. The calling of the name, which just moments before was a plea for life, now became the first eulogy, an acknowledgement of the identity that had been lost. With the conclamatio complete, a sombre set of tasks would begin. A family member would gently close the eyes of the deceased, sealing the windows to the soul, and then straighten the limbs. And now the family would step back. The most intimate farewells had been made, and it was time for the professionals to take over. These were the palinktors, a specific class of Undertaker. They were part of a larger funeral guild run by a figure known as the Libertinarius, who essentially operated as a full-service funeral director from their office near the Temple of Venus Libertinar, the goddess who presided over funerals. You could go to the Libertinarius and arrange everything, from the washers and anointers to the musicians and professional mourners. It was a one-stop shop for a respectable departure. The Pollentors would arrive at the home, bringing with them their tools of the trade, oils, perfumes, spices, and clean linens. Their first task was to wash the body. This was done with warm water, a final act of purification and care. It was a practical step, of course, but also deeply symbolic, washing away the lingering traces of illness and the struggles of life, preparing the body for its new static state. Once washed and thoroughly dried, the process of anointing began. This was a far cry from a simple moisturizing. The body would be meticulously rubbed with a variety of precious oils and perfumes. Myrrh, frankincense, and other fragrant balms were used lavishly, not for embalming in the Egyptian sense. The Romans generally didn't practice that, but for two other reasons. The first was preservation, albeit a temporary one. A Roman house, especially in the summer, was not a cool environment. The anointing was a desperate aromatic battle against the inevitable processes of decay. The goal was to keep the deceased presentable for the period of lying in state, which could last for several days. It was a last-ditch effort to ensure the recently departed smelled more like a pleasant garden, and less like, well, the alternative. The second reason was honor. The expense and quality of the perfumes used were a direct reflection of the family's wealth and status. A powerful senator's body would be slathered in the most exotic and costly ointments from the farthest corners of the empire, a final, fragrant testament to his importance. After the anointing, the deceased was dressed. This was no simple matter of choosing a favorite outfit. The clothing was rigidly dictated by social custom and law. For an ordinary male citizen, the garment was the toga pura, the simple, unadorned white toga that was the hallmark of Roman citizenship. It was a symbol of his identity, his place in the civic order. He had worn it in life for formal occasions, and he would wear it now for his final public appearance. If the man had been a magistrate, a senator, or a consul, he would be dressed in the toga praetexta, the toga with the distinctive purple border that signified his high office. It was his final status update, etched in fabric, for the very wealthy and celebrated, such as a general who had been awarded a triumph. They might even be dressed in the toga picta, a lavish, all-purple toga embroidered with gold thread. It was the ultimate power suit. Women were typically dressed in their finest stola, the traditional garment for a Roman matron. The deceased would be adorned with any honours they had received in life, a military medal, or most commonly, a floral crown, a simple, beautiful tribute. Once the body was prepared, it was time for the staging. The deceased was carefully lifted onto a grand funeral couch known as the lectus funebris. This was not the bed they had died in. It was a special piece of furniture, often ornate and expensive, sometimes crafted from wood with ivory or bronze inlays, and draped with rich purple or black cloth. This couch was then carried out of the bedroom and into the most public space of the Roman house, the atrium. The atrium was the home's reception hall, its grand central court, open to the sky through the compluvium in the roof. It was the first room any visitor would enter. To place the deceased here was to move them from the private sphere of the family into the public realm. This was the beginning of the public farewell. The couch was positioned carefully, and always in the same way, with the feet of the deceased pointing directly towards the open front door of the house. The symbolism was unmistakable and poignant. The person was on their way out. They were beginning their final journey, and this was the direction of their departure. No one could enter the house without immediately understanding that this home was in a state of mourning, and that the person on the couch was ready to leave it for the last time. With the body in place, the final touches were added to the scene. This is where ritual and folk belief intertwined. A small coin, typically an as or an obol of low value, was placed into the mouth of the deceased. This was the famous fare for Charon, the grim, spectral ferryman of the Underworld. The belief, borrowed from the Greeks, was that the souls of the dead had to cross the river Styx, or sometimes the Acheron, to reach the land of the dead. Charon would pilot his rickety skiff across the murky waters, but he did not work for free. Without the coin to pay him, a soul would be doomed to wander the near bank of the river for 100 years, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. Think of it as the ultimate one-way subway fare, a single, non-refundable token for a journey from which there was no return. While educated, Stoic Romans might have viewed this as a quaint superstition. It was a tradition so deeply ingrained in the culture that it was performed almost universally, a small piece of insurance for the soul, just in case the old stories were true. The house itself was now marked for mourning. Branches of cypress or pine, trees associated with death and the underworld, were hung over the main doorway. This served as a public notice to passers-by that a death had occurred within, and also acted as a ritual purification for those entering and leaving the home. The cypress, which does not regenerate when cut down, was a particularly potent symbol of the finality of death. It was the ancient equivalent of a black wreath on the door, a somber signal to the entire neighborhood. Inside the atrium, the air would become thick and heavy with scent and sound. Around the lectors fronbrus, oil lamps would be lit, kept burning day and night. The soft, flickering light was meant to honor the dead, and, some believed, to ward off malevolent spirits. Incense burners would be placed strategically, sending up plumes of fragrant smoke. The smell of myrrh and frankincense would now be constant, a necessary and beautiful mask for the realities of a body lying in state in the Italian heat. The couch itself would be strewn with flowers, and wreaths would be placed upon the head and chest of the deceased. The Romans loved flowers, and saw them as symbols of both beauty and the fleeting nature of life, making them a perfect funereal tribute. For the great aristocratic families, this was also the moment for another, truly remarkable display. This was the displaying of the imagines. The imagines were wax masks, portrait masks, that had been moulded directly from the faces of distinguished ancestors at the time of their deaths. These were not artists' renderings. They were eerily lifelike, three-dimensional records of the family's lineage. Each mask was stored in its own wooden cabinet in the atrium, and on the occasion of a new death, the cabinets would be opened. The masks of the great-grandfather who was a consul, the great-great-uncle who was a general, the long line of senators and magistrates would be brought out. Sometimes they were simply displayed, a silent council of ancestors observing the newest addition to their ranks. At the funeral procession itself, actors would be hired to wear these masks, literally bringing the ancestors back to life, to escort their descendant on his final journey. In the atrium, their presence transformed the scene. It was a powerful visual statement of heritage and continuity. It told every visitor, this person who has died was not just an individual, they were the latest link in an unbroken chain of greatness. Their death diminishes a legacy that stretches back for generations. And then there was the sound. Roman grief was not a quiet, private affair. It was meant to be performed, to be seen and heard. The female members of the family would take up positions around the funeral couch. Their hair would be dishevelled, their clothing might be torn or dark, and they would begin a formal, ritualized lament. This wasn't simply crying, it was a performance of sorrow. They would beat their breasts, scratch their cheeks, and call out praises for the deceased, recounting their virtues, their accomplishments, and the terrible void their absence would create. For those who could afford it, this chorus of familial grief would be augmented by professionals. These were the profica, hired female mourners, who were in essence professional criers. They were experts in the art of public lamentation. They would sing sorrowful dirges, wail at the appropriate moments, and generally amplify the atmosphere of grief to a level befitting the deceased's status. It sounds strange to us, this idea of grief as a service industry, but for the Romans, it was about ensuring the performance was adequate. A quiet funeral was a poor funeral. A loud theatrical display of sorrow, with professional wailers raising the roof, was a sign of respect. It ensured that the entire neighborhood, if not the entire city, was aware of the magnitude of the family's loss. This entire tableau, the perfumed body on its grand couch, the feet pointing towards the door, the flickering lamps, the thick incense, the ancestral masks, the chorus of wailing, would remain in place for a period of several days. This was the lying-in state. It gave friends, family, clients of a patron, and colleagues time to come and pay their respects. They would enter the atrium, offer condolences, perhaps share a memory of the deceased, and witness the magnificent sorrowful display the family had orchestrated. The whole affair was a carefully managed piece of theatre, where every detail, from the coin in the mouth to the branches on the door, was rich with meaning. It was an intricate dance of practicality and symbolism, of genuine grief and public performance. It was the family's first and most critical opportunity to shape the narrative of the deceased's life and death. Before the grand procession ever stepped out into the streets, the battle against oblivion was already being waged here, in the heart of the Roman home, a space transformed by death into a stage for memory. Chapter 3. A city in mourning, the spectacle of the funeral procession. And now it was time to take that stage out of the home and onto the grandest theatre of all, the streets of Rome itself. The battle against oblivion, first waged in the quiet incense-filled atrium, was about to go public. It was about to become a spectacle, a performance of power and memory so audacious that it would bring the entire city to a standstill. This was the pompa funebri, the funeral procession, and it was anything but a somber, quiet shuffle from one point to another. For the Roman elite, this was the final, and perhaps most important piece of public relations a person could ever have. It wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was a thunderous declaration of a family's importance, a living, moving, wailing billboard of their lineage and their legacy. So, let's step out of that darkened house, leaving the scent of cypress and the quiet vigil behind. The great bronze doors swing open, and the first thing that hits you isn't a wave of sadness, but a wave of sound. The Roman aristocracy did not believe in a quiet exit. Before the body, before the family, came the musicians, horn players. Their instruments, long and gleaming, would blast out solemn, powerful notes that echoed off the stone buildings. Flutists would play high, reedy melodies, weaving a strange, almost ethereal tune through the heavier tones of the brass. It was a sound designed to command attention, to make every shopkeeper, every senator, every street vendor stop what they were doing and turn their heads. This was not the gentle, organ-led melancholy we might associate with a funeral today. This was an announcement. It was auditory shock and awe, a fanfare that declared, someone of immense importance is on their final journey. Pay attention. It cut through the usual city din of rolling cartwheels, shouting merchants and clanging hammers, imposing its own unique and mournful rhythm on the day. And once your ears were captured, your eyes would be drawn to the next, and perhaps most theatrical, part of the ensemble, the professional mourners. These were the proficae, women hired specifically for their ability to produce a convincing and very public display of overwhelming grief, and they were worth every sestertius. This wasn't a subtle tear dabbed with a handkerchief. This was operatic, a full-body performance of sorrow. Dressed in dark, dishevelled robes, they would lead the procession, wailing with an almost terrifying intensity. They beat their chests with their fists, the rhythmic thudding adding another layer to the funereal orchestra. They tore at their own hair, a visceral symbol of being driven mad with grief. They would even scratch their own cheeks until they drew blood, a shocking and unforgettable sight. They sang dirges, mournful songs composed for the occasion, praising the virtues of the deceased in loud, lamenting tones. Now, it's easy for us to look back on this and see it as cynical, as manufactured emotion. And in a way it was. These women were professionals. This was their job. But for the Romans, this public display was essential. Grief wasn't meant to be a private internal affair. It was a social obligation, a final duty owed to the dead. The scale of your grief had to match the scale of the person you had lost. A great man required a great mourning. The family, often stoic and composed by duty, outsourced the most chaotic and messy expressions of loss to these specialists. The profici served as a kind of emotional proxy, performing the wild, unrestrained sorrow that social decorum might forbid the actual family from displaying. They created a bubble of intense, undeniable mourning around the procession, ensuring that no one watching could mistake the gravity of the event. They were, in essence, the masters of sorrowful atmosphere, ensuring the entire city felt the weight of this passing. Following this vanguard of professional lament came perhaps the most surreal element of the entire affair. Here we meet the mimi, or mimes actors, who played a crucial role in this street theatre. One actor in particular, the lead mime known as the archimemes, would don a wax mask made in the exact likeness of the deceased. This wasn't some generic symbolic mask, it was a portrait, a persona, wearing the clothes and insignia of the man who had just died, his toga, his senatorial rings. This actor would proceed to impersonate him. He would mimic his walk, his characteristic gestures, the way he held his head. If the deceased was known for a particular brand of sharp wit, the archimemes might even repeat some of his famous quips, or tell his favourite jokes to the crowd. Can you just pause and imagine that for a moment? You're standing on a crowded Roman street, and the funeral procession of a famous consul is passing by, and there, walking among the mourners, is the consul himself, or a terrifyingly accurate facsimile of him, brought back to life by an actor, waving to the crowd, perhaps reenacting a famous moment from one of his speeches. It is a level of psychological strangeness that is hard for us to comprehend. It's part tribute, part performance art, and entirely unnerving. The idea was to create a sense of continuity, to remind the public of the living man, not just the body that was soon to be ash. It was a way of saying, look, his spirit, his personality, is so strong that it's still with us, walking among us one last time. It blurred the line between the living and the dead in a way that was uniquely Roman, transforming a somber march into a ghostly and deeply memorable piece of public theatre. But even the sight of a famous man's ghost impersonator paled in comparison to what came next. This was the centerpiece, the true expression of a family's power, the element that separated the merely wealthy from the truly noble. This was the parade of the ancestors. Following the mimes was a long, silent, and deeply impressive line of other actors. Each one also wore a wax mask and a margot, but these weren't masks of the man who had just died. These were the death masks of his ancestors. Every distinguished male ancestor who had ever held high office, a consul, a censor, a praetor, was represented. Each actor was dressed in the robes of office, appropriate to the man he was portraying, complete with the purples and reds that signified his rank. The result was a silent, magnificent procession of ghosts from the family's past. The great-grandfather who had fought in the Punic Wars, the great-great-uncle who had built a famous aqueduct, the patriarch who had first won the family its senatorial rank centuries ago. This was, without a doubt, the ultimate power move. It was a living, breathing family tree brought to life. It was a history lesson on foot. As the procession moved through the forum, knowledgeable onlookers would whisper to each other, "Look, there's Cornelius Scipio Africanus," or "That's Fabius Maximus." It was a visceral reminder to everyone, to political rivals, to the common people, to aspiring families, that this wasn't just the death of one man. It was a momentary loss for a dynasty, a clan whose roots went deep into the very foundations of the Republic. It said, "We were here long before you, and we will be here long after. Our contribution to Rome is written in flesh, and now in wax." These imagines, these ancestor masks, were the family's most prized possessions. They were kept in the atrium of the family home, each in its own small wooden cupboard, like a gallery of revered saints. On feast days, the cupboards would be opened, the masks garlanded with bay leaves. They were tangible links to the past, the source of the family's dignitas and autoritas, their prestige and authority. To be able to parade them through the city was the ultimate status symbol. It was like a museum taking its entire collection of masterpieces out for a walk. For a family to have a long line of these masks was to have a verifiable, visible claim to greatness. And for a man to be the first in his family to achieve high office, a novus homo, or new man, his death was a moment of triumph, because he would be the first of his line to have an imago made, the one to begin the ghostly parade for all his descendants. His funeral was not just an end, but the beginning of a new branch of the family's visible glory. Only after this incredible spectacle, the blaring horns, the wailing women, the impersonator of the dead man, and the silent, imposing parade of all his great ancestors, did you finally see the body itself. The deceased was carried on a lavish couch, or lectus funebris. This was no simple casket. It was often ornately carved from wood or ivory, draped in rich purple and gold cloth, the family's finest embroidery. The body itself was, as we discussed, fully prepared and on display, not hidden away. He was dressed in the finest robes of the highest office he had attained in life, a final, silent testament to his achievements. He was propped up on cushions, his head raised, so it almost looked as though he were merely resting, presiding over his own magnificent parade. Surrounding the bier were torchbearers. Even if it was broad daylight, the flames a symbol of life and purification. And close by, walking in quiet dignity, were the actual family members. The sons would have their heads covered as a sign of mourning, while the daughters would walk with their hair unbound and dishevelled. Unlike the performative grief of the prosike, their sorrow was expected to be stoic, dignified and restrained. Their public role was to project stability and continuity, to show the world that even with this great loss, the family endured. The procession was a carefully calibrated machine of emotion, the wild, outsourced grief at the front, the quiet, noble grief of the family at the centre, all of it wrapped in a stunning display of historical power. This grand column of people and ghosts would snake its way through the city. The route was not accidental. It would deliberately pass by significant landmarks, perhaps buildings the deceased or his ancestors had constructed, or places where they had won great political victories. The ultimate destination was often the Roman Forum, the very heart of public life. Here the procession would halt, The bier would be set down before the rostra, the speaker's platform, and all those actors wearing the masks of the ancestors would take their seats on ivory chairs, arranged in a silent semicircle of judgment, a spectral senate of the family's past. Then a son or another close male relative would ascend the rostra to deliver the funeral oration, the laudatio funebris, standing there, before the body of his father, surrounded by the waxen faces of all his great forefathers. He would deliver a speech recounting the achievements of the deceased. He would list his military victories, his political offices, his contributions to the state, but he wouldn't stop there. He would then gesture to the silent figures seated behind him and recount their great deeds as well, starting with the most ancient and working his way forward. It was a recitation of the family's entire highlight reel, a verbal monument to their dynasty, delivered at the city's most prestigious address. It was the story of Rome, told through the lens of one powerful family, and as you stood in that crowd, listening to the speech, you would understand the true purpose of the pompa funebris. It was a mechanism for imprinting memory onto the public consciousness. It used sound, sight, and story to ensure that this man and his entire lineage would not be forgotten. It was a social and political necessity for the elite, a way of constantly reinforcing the architecture of power in the city. Of course, this jaw-dropping spectacle was the privilege of a tiny fraction of Rome's population. What about the vast majority? What about the shopkeeper, the baker, the legionary, the potter? What was their final journey like? For them, there was no parade of ancestors, for they likely had no famous ancestors to parade. There were no hired mourners, no actors, no blaring trumpets. Their processions were humble, quiet, and practical. Most funerals for the common people, the plebeians, were handled by professional undertakers called the libertinari. These were the men you paid to get the job done efficiently and affordably. Instead of an ornate ivory couch, the body was carried on a simple rented bier, a sandapilla. A few family members and perhaps some friends would follow, their grief genuine and unperformed. And crucially, these funerals almost always took place at night. This wasn't for some deep, symbolic reason. It was pure practicality. For one, it was cheaper, but more importantly, it kept the streets clear for the business of the living during the day. The final journey of a common person was not meant to interrupt the life of the city. It was scheduled to happen when it would cause the least amount of fuss. A small group of people, carrying a simple bier, lit only by a few flickering torches, making their way through the dark, silent streets towards the public burial grounds or pyres outside the city walls. The contrast could not be more stark. The aristocrat's death commandeered the city in broad daylight, demanding its attention with a blast of noise and a parade of history. The commoner's death slipped quietly through the city in the dead of night, a silent, fleeting shadow on its way to be forgotten by all but a few. The pompa funebris, then, was a perfect reflection of Roman society. It was a world where even in death, especially in death, class and status were everything. Your final journey through the streets was a direct measure of your importance in life. For the elite, it was the last great act of a life lived in public, a spectacular and slightly bizarre piece of theatre designed to cheat oblivion. For everyone else, it was a quiet, private necessity, a final, humble acceptance of it. And as the torchlight from the plebeian funeral faded into the darkness, or the last horn blast of the noble procession echoed through the forum, the city would move on, having been reminded once more of the deep, unbreachable lines that divided the world of the living and the grand theatrical world of the Roman dead. Chapter 4. From Flesh to Ash, the Rites of Committal and the Architecture of Death. But the world of the Roman dead was not some ethereal, invisible realm. It was a physical place. A suburb, really, because once the procession, grand or humble, reached the city gates, it had to keep going. One of the oldest and most sacred laws of Rome, dating back to the 12 Tables, was an ironclad rule, hominum mortuum, in urbe nisepelito neve urito, no one shall bury or burn a dead man in the city. It was a matter of both sanitation and spiritual hygiene. The world of the living was for the living, and the domain of the dead, the manes, had to be kept separate, just outside the sacred boundary, the pomerium. So the final journey was always a trip out of town. The great roads that radiated from Rome, the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, were not just arteries for commerce and legions, they were grand avenues of remembrance. For miles outside the city, these roads were lined with the architecture of death. Tombs, monuments, mausoleums and cemeteries crowded the roadsides, creating a sprawling necropolis, a literal city of the dead that every traveller had to pass through. It was the ancient world's most elaborate and permanent billboard campaign, a constant, silent declaration to everyone entering or leaving the capital of the world: we were here, we mattered, do not forget us. And at the end of that procession, whether it was a simple handcart or a column of hired mourners, came the final transformative act. For most of Roman history, particularly during the Republic and early Empire, that act was fire. The destination was a designated plot of land, a family burial ground, or a public cremation area called an ostrinium. Here, the centerpiece of the final ceremony was prepared, the funeral pyre, or rogus, and this was no simple bonfire. The construction of the rogus was a craft, a piece of temporary architecture with its own rules and symbolism. It was built like a log cabin or an altar, a square structure of stacked wood, with the interior left hollow for the bier to be placed inside. The choice of wood was important. You didn't just use any old timber you had lying around. The ideal woods were those that burned hot and fast, and especially those that produced a pleasant, aromatic smoke. Resinous woods like pine and fir were common, their pitch ensuring a strong, consistent flame. Cypress was a favourite, a tree sacred to the Underworld and to Pluto himself, its dark, fragrant wood a fitting tribute. Yew, another tree associated with death, was also used. The goal was not just to consume the body, but to do so in a way that was ritually pure and aesthetically pleasing, if one can use that term. The smoke was seen as a vehicle, carrying the soul, the anima, upwards to the celestial realm. You wanted that final journey to be on a cloud of fragrant, noble smoke, not the sputtering, acrid mess of green wood. Before the torch was lit, the body would be prepared. The family would perform the final conclamation, calling out the deceased's name one last time, a final desperate attempt to see if they might still stir. The person lighting the pyre, typically a son or other close relative, would do so with their head turned away. It was considered improper, a violation of paiei, to watch the flames take hold of a loved one. It was an act done out of duty, but with averted eyes, a gesture of profound grief and respect. As the pyre was lit and the flames began their work, a torrent of offerings would be thrown into the fire. This wasn't just about sentiment, it was about honouring the dead with the best things from the world of the living. Expensive perfumes and unguents were poured over the wood and the body, thick nards and oils that would vaporize in the heat, creating dense clouds of scent to mingle with the burning wood. Spices from the far corners of the empire, cinnamon, cassia, myrrh, frankincense, were cast into the flames. Think of the most expensive incense you can imagine, and then imagine throwing pounds of it onto a massive bonfire. For the funeral of the fabulously wealthy, this was a display of conspicuous consumption that bordered on the absurd. Pliny the Elder grumbled that Arabia couldn't produce enough spices in a year to keep up with the amount Nero burned at the funeral of his wife Poppaea. Food and drink were also offered, a final feast for the spirit. Honey cakes, fruits, and cups of wine were tossed into the fire. Sometimes personal possessions of the deceased were added, a favourite tunic, a tool from their trade, a letter. For a soldier, it might be a piece of his armour, or a weapon, now useless in the mortal world. For a child, a favourite toy. These were the things that defined a life, now being offered up to accompany the soul on its journey. And in the very earliest, most archaic periods, this could take a darker turn. Animals, such as a favourite horse or dog, could be sacrificed and burned on the pyre. In the most extreme and legendary cases, like the funeral of Patroclus in the Iliad, which the Romans so admired, even human sacrifices were made, though this was vanishingly rare in historical Rome. The fire itself was a powerful, terrifying, and mesmerizing force. It was the ultimate purifier. It dissolved the corruptible flesh, the part of the human that was bound to decay, and the earth, and released the eternal part. For the Romans, this wasn't just a practical method of disposal. It was a profound chemical and spiritual transformation. You watched as a person you knew, their specific face and form, was reduced to the elemental, to anonymous ash and whitened bone. It was a process that could take hours, a long, smoky vigil as the sun set, and the pyre glowed against the night sky. But for the Roman elite, there was one more piece of public theatre to perform before the ashes cooled. If the deceased was a man of any political or social standing, a senator, a magistrate, a famous general, the procession would make a crucial stop before it ever left the city. It would wind its way into the very heart of Rome, into the Forum. There, in the bustling centre of Roman life, surrounded by the temples, law courts and the Senate House, A bier would be set down before the rostra, the speaker's platform, an honor guard of family members, often including those wearing the wax imagines of the ancestors, would stand by, and then a son or another close male relative would ascend the platform to deliver the formal eulogy, the laudatio funebris. This was not the quiet, personal remembrance you might find at a modern funeral. The laudatio was a piece of high-stakes political rhetoric. Yes, it was a speech in praise of the dead, but it was delivered to a crowd of citizens, rivals, allies, and voters. Its true purpose was not just to honor the man who had died, but to burnish the reputation and advance the prospects of the family he left behind. The orator would recount the deceased's life story, but it would be a heavily curated version. Every military victory would be magnified. Every political office held would be presented as a triumph of wisdom and public service. Their virtues, their courage, their piety, their loyalty to the state would be listed in exhaustive detail. Their lineage would be traced back, often with a healthy dose of creative genealogy, to the founding heroes of Rome, or even to the gods themselves. Julius Caesar, for instance, famously used the funeral of his Aunt Julia to remind everyone of his family's divine descent from Venus. It was a political press conference disguised as a moment of grief. The speech was a way of saying, "Look at the great man we have lost. But do not despair, for we, his descendants, are forged from the same incredible stock. We carry on his legacy. The values and power you admired in him, you can now find in us." It was a transfer of political and social capital, performed on the most public stage imaginable. The ancestors in their wax masks stood by as silent witnesses, a visual reinforcement of the family's long and glorious history. The whole performance was a masterclass in using the dead to secure the future of the living. For a young man just starting his political career, delivering a powerful laudatio for his father was the perfect launchpad, a chance to introduce himself to the Roman people and wrap himself in the glory of his heritage. It was the ultimate networking event, held over an open casket. Once the speeches were done and the last echoes of praise faded from the forum, the procession would resume its slow march out of the city to the pyre. And after the fire had finally died down, after hours of burning, the most delicate part of the ritual would begin. The embers of the rogus would be doused with wine, the liquid hissing on the hot coals, its aroma mingling with the lingering scent of incense and burnt cypress. This act both cooled the remains and ritually cleansed the site. Then, the family, primarily the women, would begin the painstaking task of collecting the remains. With their bare hands, shrouded in black robes, they would sift through the cooled ash and charcoal. What they were looking for were the fragments of bone, the ossa, which had been calcified and whitened by the intense heat. This was not a quick or easy job. It was a slow, intimate, and somber process. They would carefully separate the human remains from the wood ash and the remnants of the offerings. It was a final, tactile connection with the physical body of their loved one, now transformed into something hard, pure, and eternal. Every small piece was gathered with reverence. According to ritual, one small piece of a finger bone, the os relictum, was sometimes set aside to be buried separately in a simple earth ceremony. This ancient rite, a holdover from a time before cremation was common, ensured that the deceased was technically buried as well as cremated, covering all the ritual bases. Once all the bone fragments were collected, they were washed. Again, wine was used, and sometimes milk, to purify the bones, to wash away the last traces of the pyre's soot, and to honor the spirit. They were then carefully dried on a clean linen cloth. This collection of clean, white bone fragments, often surprisingly small, was all that was left. The final resting place for these remains was a funerary urn, known as an olla or an urna. These could be simple, terracotta pots for the less well-off, or incredibly ornate vessels for the rich. Some were carved from alabaster, a soft, translucent stone that seemed to glow from within. Others were made of marble, sometimes intricately carved with scenes from mythology or portraits of the deceased. There were even urns made of precious coloured glass, like the famous Portland vase, a masterpiece of cameo glass that likely once held the ashes of a member of the imperial family. The bones were carefully placed inside the urn. Sometimes a small amount of the pyre's ash was included, and perhaps a final splash of perfume or a few dried flowers. The lid was sealed, and the name of the deceased was often inscribed on the side. This small sealed vessel now contained everything that remained of a Roman life. It was a concentration of memory, a physical anchor for the family's grief and continued devotion. This urn was the final package, but it still needed a home. and that home was somewhere in the vast necropolis that flanked the roads to Rome. As a traveller, you would leave the noise and chaos of the city behind, only to enter a different kind of city, a silent, orderly one, built of stone and marble. The Roman necropolis was not a sombre, hidden-away place like a modern cemetery. It was a public and highly visible landscape. The tombs were built to be seen, to be read, to be admired, and the variety was staggering. It was a physical catalogue of Roman social structure, a story of wealth, class and identity, told in architecture. For the 1% of the Roman world, the immensely powerful and fabulously wealthy families, the tomb was the ultimate status symbol. These were not simple graves, they were monumental structures, built to last for eternity, and to project the family's power long after its members were gone. We call them mausoleums, a name derived from the tomb of King Mausolus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Romans adopted the idea with gusto. Think of the tomb of Caecilia Metella on the Appian Way. It's a massive circular tower of travertine stone, 65 feet in diameter, set on a square base. It's more of a fortress than a tomb. It dominates the landscape. The inscription is simple and bold. To Caecilia Metella, daughter of Quintus Creticus, and wife of Crassus. That's it. She was the daughter-in-law of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and a member of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. The tomb doesn't need to tell you more. Its sheer size and expense scream power, influence, and the kind of wealth that can afford to build a small castle for a single urn. It was designed to awe every single person who walked or rode past it on the busiest road in the Roman world. Or consider the mausoleum of Augustus, built for himself and his family in the Campus Martius. It was an enormous circular mound of earth planted with cypress trees, ringed by a massive stone wall, and topped with a bronze statue of the emperor himself. In front of it stood 2 obelisks and bronze plaques inscribed with the res gestae, Augustus's own account of his life's achievements, the longest and most self-congratulatory resume in history. It wasn't just a tomb, it was a public park, a dynastic monument, a statement that the Julio-Claudian family was not just ruling Rome, but had become a permanent part of its very landscape. These structures were often adorned with elaborate sculptures, reliefs depicting the deceased's life, and gardens. Some even had rooms inside for commemorative banquets, the refrigerator, where the family would gather on anniversaries to share a meal in the presence of the dead, a tradition that kept the connection between living and deceased family members alive and well. It was a polite, ritualized picnic with your ancestors' ashes. But what about everyone else? What about the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the clerks, the freed slaves, the millions of ordinary people who made up the bulk of Rome's population? They couldn't afford a fortress tomb on the Appian Way. For them, death presented a very real and frightening possibility. Not just oblivion, but improper disposal. To be left unburied was a terrible fate, your spirit doomed to wander restlessly for 100 years. So they came up with a brilliantly practical, collective solution, the columbarium. The name columbarium literally means dovecote or pigeon house, and when you see one, you understand why. They were large, often semi-underground chambers, and their walls were honeycombed with hundreds, sometimes thousands of small arched niches, the loculi, stacked in neat rows from floor to ceiling. Each niche was just large enough to hold 1 or 2 funerary urns. It was, in essence, an apartment building for the dead. These were not built by individuals, but by groups. A wealthy patron might build one for his household staff and freedmen, a gesture of paternalistic care that also ensured his own name would be honoured by generations of their descendants. More commonly, they were built by burial societies called collegia funeratia. These collegia were one of the most remarkable features of Roman social life. They were, for all intents and purposes, clubs or fraternities organised for the express purpose of guaranteeing every member a proper burial. Members would pay monthly dues into a common fund. This money would be used to purchase the land, construct the columbarium, and cover the expenses of cremation and the funerary rites for any member who passed away. It was a form of social insurance, a way for people of modest means to pool their resources and escape the horror of the potter's field. But they were more than just financial arrangements. The collegia were communities. They had their own statutes, their own elected officials, and their own patron deities. They held regular meetings and social dinners. They provided a sense of belonging and solidarity for people who were often far from their original homes, rootless in the vast metropolis of Rome. In a society with rigid hierarchies, your collegium was a place where you had a voice and a recognized place, When you died, you knew your clubmates would be there to carry your bier, to ensure the rites were performed correctly, and to place your urn in its niche among friends. Walking into a preserved columbarium today is a deeply moving experience. The sheer density of lives is overwhelming. Underneath each niche, there is often a small marble plaque, meticulous with a simple inscription, to Amemptus, servant of Tiberius Caesar, to Fortunata, who lived 24 years, to Felix the baker, row after row, life after life. Sometimes the niches are still decorated with faded frescoes, a painted bird, a garland of flowers, a small scene from mythology. You can almost feel the quiet communal dignity of the place. It was a pragmatic and profoundly human solution to the universal problem of mortality. It was a way for the anonymous masses to ensure that they too would have a name and a place, a permanent address in the city of the dead. Between the two extremes, the monumental mausoleum and the communal columbarium, lay a whole spectrum of other tomb types. There were simpler house tombs, shaped like small temples or houses, often with a dining room for those commemorative banquets. There were pyramid tombs, like the still extant Pyramid of Sistius, a bizarre and wonderful monument built by a magistrate who was likely swept up in the Egyptomania that followed the conquest of Egypt. There were simple enclosures with memorial altars, known as sepulchra. The roadsides were a chaotic, competitive jumble of architectural styles and ambitions, and on nearly every one of them, from the grandest to the humblest, was an inscription. The Roman tombstone was a direct communication from the dead to the living. If you find writing an email stressful, imagine having to summarize your entire existence in a few lines of Latin to be carved in stone for all time. These inscriptions followed certain formulas. They often began with the letters DM, for dismanibus, to the spirits of the dead. This was a dedication, placing the tomb under the protection of the divine spirits of the underworld. Then came the name of the deceased, in the dative case, showing to whom the monument was dedicated. Their age at death was often recorded with painstaking precision. Vixit annos dux death. Mensis vixit, dies X. He lived 25 years, 6 months and 10 days. This wasn't just about record keeping. It was a lament for a life cut short, a way of grasping at the specific tangible reality of the time they had on earth. The inscription would also name the person who commissioned the tomb, a wife for her beloved husband, Conugi Carissimo, a son for his deserving father, Patri Benemerenti, a master for his faithful freedman, Liberto Pientissimo. The language is full of these superlatives, a final public declaration of love and duty. But the most fascinating inscriptions are the ones that go beyond the formula. They give us a tiny, brilliant flash of an individual life. We learn their profession: a baker, a doctor, a charioteer, a pearl merchant. We see their values. An inscription for a woman might praise her as Univira, a one-man woman who was married only once, a high Roman ideal. It might celebrate her skill in weaving wool, her modesty, her piety. Some inscriptions speak directly to the traveller on the road. The phrase "Siste viator," stop traveller, is a common opening, a plea from the dead to the living, to pause for just a moment and read their story, to speak their name aloud, and so keep their memory alive. Some offer simple advice. What I am, you will be. What you are, I once was. Enjoy your life. Others are poignant. I, who was once a celebrated beauty, am now a handful of ash in a small pot. And some are even funny, or at least try to be. One famous inscription reads, Balnea vina Venus corrumpunt corpora nostra, sed vitam faciunt balnea vina Venus. Baths, wine and love corrupt our bodies, but baths, wine and love make life itself. It's a cheerful Epicurean shrug from beyond the grave. These inscriptions were the final weapon in the Roman war against oblivion. The tomb gave the body a permanent home. The inscription gave the name a permanent voice. As long as someone could read the words, the person was not truly gone. They existed in the memory of the passerby. This is why tombs were built on busy roads, not in quiet, secluded parks. They needed an audience. They were a part of the daily life of the Roman world, a constant stony chorus of ancestors lining the way to the city, reminding everyone of the two certainties of Roman life: death, and the desperate, undying hope of being remembered. The ashes were cool, the urn was sealed, the tomb was built. The private grief of the family had been transformed into a public statement, a permanent piece of the Roman landscape. The dead were now at rest, but their stories, carved in stone, were just beginning. Chapter 5. Feasting with the Ancestors. The enduring cult of the dead. Because for the Romans, you see, at rest didn't mean gone. It didn't even really mean finished. The construction of the tomb wasn't the final act of a play. It was merely the building of a new stage. The deceased had simply moved to a new address, a quieter neighborhood just outside the city walls, and the relationship with them was about to enter a new, and in many ways more demanding phase. The frantic public performance of grief was over, but the long, quiet and deeply woven work of remembrance was only just beginning. The dead were now neighbors, and like any neighbors, they needed to be visited, they needed to be fed, and crucially, they needed to be kept happy. This next phase began almost immediately, with a structured and surprisingly bureaucratic period of mourning known as the Novum Dialis. This was a 9-day affair, a kind of spiritual and social quarantine for the family. Think of it as a formal cooling-off period, not just for the raw emotions of grief, but for the very soul of the deceased and the spiritual state of the household. The house itself was still considered polluted by death, or funestus. The cypress branch might still be outside the door, a clear signal to any passing priest or magistrate that they should not enter and risk ritual contamination. Inside, the family remained in their dark mourning clothes, the toga pull. Life was muted, business was suspended. The normal rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and social calls fell silent. It was a house holding its breath. For 9 days this state of limbo persisted. It was a time for the family to adjust to the new vacancy in their lives, and perhaps more importantly from a Roman perspective, it was a time for the spirit of the departed to settle into its new existence. The Romans, practical in all things, even the afterlife, seemed to understand that such a monumental transition couldn't be rushed. You couldn't just have a funeral on Tuesday and be back to haggling in the forum on Wednesday. There was a process. The soul needed time to acclimate, and the living needed a buffer before they could be considered ritually clean and re-enter the bustling, sacred life of the city. And at the end of this 9-day period came the event that officially closed the books on the immediate mourning, a special feast, the Cena Novum Dialis. This wasn't a sombre affair held in the now quiet family home. No, this was a meal taken at the tomb itself. The family, having purified the house with a ritual sweeping and a formal sacrifice of a sheep, would pack up a picnic of sorts and go out to the city of the dead along the Appian Way or the Via Latina. There, amidst the stone monuments and cypress trees, they would share a meal in the presence of their newly departed. Imagine the scene. A family, now in clean white togas, reclining on couches they've brought with them, or perhaps in a purpose-built dining room attached to the tomb if they were wealthy. The sun is setting, casting long shadows from the mausoleums. They pour out libations of wine, letting it soak into the earth or trickle down a special tube leading directly to the burial chamber below. They would eat specific foods, often eggs, which were universal symbols of rebirth and the continuation of life, lentils, bread, and a little salt. It was a meal of purification, a symbolic breaking of the fast of intense grief. There's a strange intimacy to it, a blend of the profoundly sad and the deeply normal. It's a dinner party where the guest of honor is, well, interred a few feet away and unavailable for conversation, at least in the conventional sense, but they were absolutely present. The meal was for them as much as it was for the living. It was an affirmation that though this person had crossed a fundamental boundary, they were still part of the family circle. This feast cleansed the family of the taint of death, allowing them to return to society, and it simultaneously welcomed the deceased into their new role as a venerated ancestor, a household spirit. It was the first of countless meals they would share together at this spot. The formal goodbye had been said, and now it was time for the long, enduring hello. This act of dining at the tomb wasn't just a sentimental gesture. It was rooted in a core concept of Roman law and religion. A Roman tomb was not just a plot of land with a monument on it. Once it had been properly consecrated, and a body interred, it became a locus religiosus, a place of religious significance. It was legally removed from the world of the living, and a bit of a wrinkle in the fabric of normal property law. It could not be sold, it could not be inherited in the usual way, and most importantly, it could not be desecrated. It became the permanent, inalienable property of the spirits of the dead who resided there, the daimons. To violate a tomb was one of the most heinous acts a Roman could commit, a crime against gods and men. It was sacrilege. This legal and spiritual protection is what made the necropolis outside the city walls so secure. It was a sanctuary. This special status meant the tomb was more than a memorial. It was an embassy of the underworld, a sacred point of contact between the living and the dead. And like any good embassy, It required upkeep and regular diplomatic visits. The family were the designated ambassadors. They were legally and morally bound to maintain the tomb, to keep it clean, and to perform the necessary rites. For the wealthy, this could be a truly elaborate affair. Their tombs weren't just stone boxes. They were complexes. They might include a small kitchen for preparing funerary meals, a covered dining room, or triclinium, with stone couches for feasting, and even wells for water. And surrounding it all, there were often funerary gardens. These weren't just for decoration, they were part of the offering. Romans loved gardens, and they believed their dead did too. They would plant flowers strongly associated with death and remembrance, roses, lilies, and especially violets. The scent of the flowers was thought to please the spirits. The gardens created a beautiful, peaceful space, turning the grim necropolis into something more akin to a modern memorial park. It was a place you would actually want to visit. Families would tend to these plots, weeding and watering, making sure their ancestors had a pleasant view, so to speak. Some wills even left behind endowments, sums of money specifically to pay for the purchase of roses to be laid on the tomb on the anniversary of their death. It was a way of ensuring your memory and your comfort in the afterlife was literally kept alive and blooming. This ongoing relationship wasn't just left to individual family schedules. The Roman calendar itself was built around the dead. It had dedicated seasons for remembrance, times when the entire city turned its attention from the world of the living to the silent world of the ancestors. The most important of these was the Parentalia. This was a 9-day festival held every February, from the 13th to the 21st. The name itself comes from parentes, meaning parents or ancestors. It was a time of deep, private family remembrance. If you imagine a modern holiday, it was something like a cross between Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, and a city-wide family reunion for the dead. During these 9 days, an unusual quiet fell over Rome. All temples were closed. No weddings were performed. Magistrates put aside their official insignia. It was considered a period outside of normal sacred time, a time when the veil between the worlds was thin, and the primary duty of every good Roman was to their lineage. This wasn't a time for grand public spectacle. It was profoundly personal. Each family was expected to go out to the tombs of their relatives. They would walk those long roads leading out of the city, carrying baskets of simple offerings. Unlike the grand sacrifices to the Olympian gods, the offerings for the daimans were humble and gentle. A little wreath of flowers, a few grains of salt, some bread soaked in wine, a scattering of loose violets. They would light lamps in the tomb chambers, the small flames flickering in the dark, and share a quiet meal, much like the Cena Novendialis, but with less of the sting of fresh grief and more of the comfortable warmth of memory. They would speak to their departed, updating them on family news, asking for their quiet blessing, and simply enjoying the peaceful shared space. It was a beautiful, solemn act of continuity. It reinforced the Roman sense of identity, which was rooted not in individualism, but in the long, unbroken chain of family. You were who you were because of the ancestors who came before you, and during the Parentalia, you paid that debt with love, food, and attention. The festival culminated on its final day, February 21st, which was known as the Feralia. This was the only public part of the proceedings, a collective, city-wide observance to honor all the dead. It was a day of purification, of setting things right with the spirit world, before the city returned to its normal business. An old woman, a sort of public witch, would perform a strange and specific rite on behalf of the city to appease a silent, potentially malevolent goddess of the dead, named Tacita, the Silent One. But for most Romans, the Feralia was simply the final day to make sure all their ancestors were fed and happy. You did not want to forget. The poet Ovid tells a cautionary tale of a time when, distracted by war, the Romans neglected the Parentalia. The story goes that the angry, hungry ghosts of the ancestors rose from their graves and swarmed through the streets of the city, their shrieks and howls filling the night until the living remembered their duties and rushed to the tombs with offerings. It's a ghost story with a clear moral. Feed your ancestors, or they will come looking for you. And this points to the other side of the Roman relationship with the dead. It wasn't all peaceful remembrance and flower-scented gardens. The Romans also had a deep-seated fear of the dead, specifically the ones who were not at peace. These were the lemures, the restless, wandering, and often malevolent ghosts. These weren't your beloved grandparents who were happily residing in their well-tended tomb. These were the spirits of those who had died violently or prematurely, those who had been improperly buried, or simply those who were forgotten and resentful. They were the hungry ghosts, the angry ones, and they required a very different kind of ritual. Their festival was the Lemuria, held over 3 nights in May, the 9th, 11th, and 13th. Unlike the family-oriented Parentalia, the Lemuria was a dark, fearful, and private ritual of exorcism. It was spiritual pest control. During these nights, just as during the Parentalia, all the temples were closed and no weddings were held. May was considered an unlucky month for a marriage precisely because of these wandering, unhappy spirits. The goal of the Lemuria was not to honour the ghosts, but to get them out of your house. Ovid, once again, gives us a detailed, almost cinematic description of the ritual. It had to be performed by the paterfamilias, the head of the household, in the dead of night. He would rise at midnight, and with bare feet, so as not to be bound to the profane earth, he would walk silently through the house. He couldn't look behind him, no matter what he heard. First, he would make a specific hand gesture to ward off any spirits he might encounter, touching his thumb to his middle fingers. Then he would wash his hands in pure spring water. Then came the strangest part. He would take black beans, beans being a mysterious and potent symbol connected to the underworld, and put them in his mouth. Then, while still walking through the darkened house and not looking back, he would spit the beans out behind him, one by one, 9 times. With each bean he would say, "With these I redeem me and mine." The belief was that the ghosts, the lemures, would hungrily gather up the beans, a symbolic offering to placate them. After the beans he would wash his hands again, and then begin to clash bronze pots or plates together, making a loud, discordant noise intended to frighten the spirits away. 9 times he would repeat the final incantation, "Spirits of my ancestors, depart." Only then, after this strange, specific, and no doubt deeply unsettling midnight ritual, could he look behind him. The house was considered cleansed. The restless dead had been fed, frightened, and formally shown the door at least for another year. These 2 festivals, the Parentalia and the Lemuria, perfectly capture the dual nature of the Roman relationship with the dead. On one hand, you have the cherished daimones, the benevolent family spirits who form the bedrock of your identity. They need love, food, and remembrance. They are a source of stability and blessing. You visit them in the sunshine of February with flowers. On the other hand, you have the terrifying limbos, the anonymous, angry spirits who represent the chaos and horror of a bad death. They need to be appeased and expelled. You deal with them at midnight in May with beans and loud noises. The Roman world was populated by both. Your duty was to cultivate the former and protect your family from the latter. The mechanics of this spiritual feeding are themselves fascinating. How practically did you get wine and food to a pile of ashes sealed in an urn inside a stone tomb? The Romans had an ingenious solution: libation tubes. Archaeologists frequently find tombs fitted with terracotta or lead pipes that run from an opening on the outside of the monument directly down into the burial chamber. Some even lead straight into the cinerary urn itself. These were a supernatural delivery service. The family could pour offerings of wine, milk, honey, or even the blood of a sacrificed animal directly into this funnel. It was a way of literally feeding the dead, of ensuring the nourishment reached them in the underworld. For tombs without these tubes, the offerings were simply poured onto the grave, with the belief that they would soak through the earth and reach the spirit below. Sometimes, small holes were drilled into the top of a stone sarcophagus for the same purpose. The act was the important thing. The dead were believed to have a kind of shadowy, ethereal existence, and they still had needs. They grew thirsty, they grew hungry, and a hungry ancestor was a grumpy and potentially dangerous ancestor. These offerings weren't just symbolic. In the Roman mind, they were providing real, if spiritual, sustenance. And so the Roman necropolis was not a static, dead place. It was a landscape of continuous activity. On any given day you would see families coming and going, tending to their ancestral plots. You'd see them weeding the gardens, cleaning the stone inscriptions, perhaps repainting the letters. You'd see them leaving small plates of food, or pouring out a cup of wine. On festival days, these cities of the dead would be bustling, filled with the low murmur of families sharing stories and the scent of flowers and spilled wine. The dead were a constant, tangible presence in Roman life. Their tombs lined the roads, serving as a daily reminder of mortality and family duty. Their needs were marked on the calendar, dictating when you could get married or when you had to stay home and spit beans. Their legal status shaped the very landscape outside the city. They could be benevolent guardians or malevolent troublemakers. You spoke to them, you fed them, you cleaned for them, and you remembered them. For a Roman, death was not a departure. It was a change of address, and the beginning of a lifelong and generation-spanning conversation. The tomb was not a final resting place. It was a front porch, and you were always expected to stop by, say hello, and leave a little something to eat. Chapter 6. The Undertaker's Ledger. The economy and industry of death. But that front porch, that eternal home with its little garden and dining couch, where future generations could stop by and leave a little wine that didn't just appear out of thin air. It wasn't a standard feature of the Roman landscape. It came with a bill, a very, very long bill, often with itemized charges that would make your eyes water, and managing that final transaction, from the first moment of death to the last libation poured at the tomb, was an industry, a vast, complex and surprisingly modern industry, humming along just beneath the surface of all that solemn ritual and heartfelt grief. It was the business of death, and in Rome, business was always booming. For a Roman, ensuring a proper burial was not a preference, it was a core spiritual and social obligation. To be left unburied, to have your body dishonoured, and your spirit left to wander restlessly, was a fate worse than death itself. It was a plunge into eternal anonymity, a terror that haunted everyone from the emperor in his palace to the slave in the scullery. And where there is a universal human terror, you will always find someone ready to sell you a solution. Enter the Libeternarius. This was the Roman Undertaker, the funeral director, the grim-faced event planner who orchestrated the entire production of your final exit. The very name was steeped in the mythology of the end. Their professional guild was headquartered, with a certain dark poetry, at the Grove of Libeternare, a goddess associated with Venus, but in her darker aspect as a deity of burials and corpses. It was here, in the shadow of her temple, that the official death registers of Rome were kept. Every Roman citizen's passing was officially recorded on a tablet, and a coin was paid to the temple. It was the state's first and most basic piece of paperwork in the process of your unbecoming. But the Libeternari who operated from the goddess's grove were far more than just morbid accountants. They were the masters of a complicated trade, one that required a unique blend of logistical genius, theatrical flair, and a strong stomach. When a family member died, you didn't just call up your relatives. Your first, most crucial call was to the nearest office of the Libeternari. They were a necessary, if slightly unsavoury, part of the urban fabric. People didn't exactly like them. Their profession was considered polluting, both ritually and socially, as constant contact with the dead was seen as unclean. But everyone, absolutely everyone, needed them. They were the ancient equivalent of your cable company, and the DMV rolled into one, except they dealt in corpses instead of slow internet and license renewals. Actually, knowing the Romans, there was probably a lot of paperwork too. When you walked into the office of a Libeternarius, you weren't there to mourn, you were there to shop. It was a business transaction, and the Undertakers had a full catalogue of services, a kind of à la carte menu for the afterlife. The first question would be a simple, if delicate one. What was the budget? Because in Rome, just as in life, death was stratified by wealth. You got the funeral you could afford, and the difference between the top and bottom tiers was staggering. Let's imagine you're a family of modest means, perhaps a shopkeeper or a skilled artisan. You would be looking at what was called a funef plebeium, a commoner's funeral. This was the entry-level package. For a set price, the Libeternarius would provide the absolute essentials. This included the services of the pollingtors. These were the specialists who handled the body itself. They would wash the corpse, anoint it with oils and perfumes, a crucial step in a hot Mediterranean climate with no refrigeration, and dress it in its finest toga. They were the ones who placed the coin in the deceased's mouth for Charon, the mythical ferryman of the River Styx. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a non-negotiable part of the process, like paying a toll. Forgetting the coin was seen as a terrible omen, condemning the soul to wander the banks of the river for 100 years. You can imagine the pollingter having a little checklist, and coin for ferryman was right at the top. The basic package also included a simple wooden coffin, a sanderpiler, and the services of the Vespilones. These were the pallbearers for the poor, and their very name hinted at their low status, deriving from Vesper, or evening. The law, specifically the 12 tables from the earliest days of the Republic, had mandated that the funerals of the poor be conducted after sunset. This was partly for public sanitation to keep potentially diseased bodies out of the crowded daytime streets, but it was also a brutally effective form of social control. A nighttime funeral was a quiet, shadowy affair, with few onlookers, It was a visual declaration of your humble place in the world. The Vespilones carrying your coffin through the dark on their shoulders, lit only by a few sputtering torches, were the crew for these stark, hurried processions to the mass graves or the cheap burial plots outside the city walls. And for your money, you might get a musician or two, a lone flute player, a tibasin, walking ahead of the procession, playing a sad, simple tune. It was the bare minimum of ceremony, enough to fulfill the religious requirements and ensure the spirit was properly sent on its way, but nothing more. It was efficient, it was affordable, and it was deeply, profoundly ordinary. But what if you were someone of consequence, a senator, a wealthy equestrian, a victorious general? Well, then you weren't interested in the budget option. You were in the market for a funus indictivum, a public funeral, an extravaganza. This was the platinum tier, the all-inclusive luxury package, and for the right price, the Libertinarius could mount a production that would be the talk of the town for months. For this kind of funeral, everything was upgraded. The preparation of the body was far more elaborate. The palinktors would use the finest imported Egyptian oils and Syrian perfumes. They might even begin a rudimentary form of embalming if the body needed to be displayed for several days, a process involving salting and packing the cavities with preservatives. But the real spectacle began with the public display. The deceased would lie in state in the atrium of their own home for up to 7 days, propped up on a magnificent funeral couch, the lectus fiumbris, draped in purple and gold cloth. Their feet were always pointed towards the door, a symbolic gesture that they were ready for their final journey. Cypress branches would be placed outside the house, a subtle, sombre signal to all passers-by that death was within. It was the Roman equivalent of a funeral wreath, a public announcement that also served to ritually purify the street outside. When the day of the procession came, the Libertinarius unleashed his entire team. He himself might not even be present, but his second-in-command, the designator, would be there, acting as the master of ceremonies. The designator was the director of this grand piece of street theatre, dressed in black and carrying a ceremonial rod. He marshalled everyone into place with the precision of a military commander. First came the musicians, and not just one sad flute. We're talking a full brass and woodwind section. There were the tibicinis on their flutes, the cornicinis blowing long, mournful notes on their curved horns, and the tubicinis with their straight trumpets. It was a wall of sound, a solemn, majestic fanfare announcing the approach of a great man. Then came the professional mourners. If your own family's grief wasn't quite theatrical enough for your public standing, you could hire it. The Libertinarius had on his payroll a troupe of profici, women who were paid to weep, wail and sing dirges in praise of the deceased. They would tear their hair, scratch their cheeks until they bled, and beat their chests in a highly stylized performance of sorrow. It sounds bizarre to us, this idea of renting grief, but for the Romans, it was a crucial part of the show. The louder the wailing, the more important the person must have been. It was a public audit of the deceased's social capital, performed by professionals. And then came the most extraordinary feature of an aristocratic Roman funeral, the ancestors. The designator would have arranged for a troupe of actors or mimi to take part in the procession. These actors would don the imagines, the wax death masks of the deceased's illustrious ancestors, which were kept in a special cabinet in the family home. They would also wear the appropriate historical costumes, the purple-bordered toga of a consul, the armour of a general. Suddenly, the procession wasn't just about the person who had died. It was a living, moving tableau of the family's entire history. You would see the great-grandfather who conquered a province, the great-great-uncle who sponsored a temple, all walking again through the streets of Rome, escorting their descendant to the afterlife. It was the ultimate power move, a stunning visual reminder to the entire city of the family's deep roots and enduring importance. Imagine watching a funeral procession today and seeing actors dressed as your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and his father before him, all marching along with the hearse. It was a powerful and slightly surreal statement. The deceased himself would be carried on that ornate funeral couch, his own face uncovered for all to see, or sometimes covered with his own freshly made wax imago. Lictors, the official bodyguards of a magistrate, might walk alongside, their bundles of rods, the fasces, pointed downwards in a sign of mourning. Behind the body came the actual family, their grief now buttressed and amplified by the professional performers around them. The sons would have their heads veiled, the daughters their hair unbound, all dressed in sombre, dark clothing. Even the family's freedmen, their former slaves, were expected to attend, wearing the cap of liberty they had been granted. as a testament to their former master's generosity. The procession would wind its way from the house down into the Roman Forum, the very heart of the city. Here, it would stop before the rostra, the speaker's platform. The funeral couch would be set down, and the deceased son, or another close male relative, would mount the platform to deliver the funeral oration, the laudatio funebris. This was no quiet eulogy. It was a full-blown public speech, recounting the deceased's life, his accomplishments, his military victories, his political offices, his virtues. And it didn't stop there. The speaker, surrounded by the actors wearing the masks of the ancestors, would then recount their achievements as well. It was a verbal genealogy, a public relations exercise that reinforced the family's brand and reminded everyone, from the plebs to the senators, just who these people were. Only after this grand public spectacle was complete would the procession reform and head out of the city gates towards the place of burial or cremation. All of this, the musicians, the wailing women, the ancestor actors, the logistical coordination of the designator, all of it was provided by the Libertinarius. Every single element had a price. So many horns, so many mourners, a certain fee for the rental of the ancestral masks. You can just picture the itemized bill. To wailing, professional, superior quality, 3 hours, so many sesterces. To impersonation of one stern-looking consul from the Punic Wars, so many sesterces. It was the business of making death unforgettable. But what about the vast majority of people, the millions who were neither destitute nor senatorial? The craftsman, the shopkeeper, the soldier, the clerk. They couldn't afford a parade of ancestors, but the thought of a lonely, dark funeral and a spot in a mass grave was unbearable. They represented the great middle market, and they came up with one of the most remarkable and practical inventions in Roman social history, the burial club, or collegium funeraticium. Think of it as afterlife insurance with a potluck dinner once a month. A collegium was a private voluntary association. Members, called sodalds, paid an initiation fee, and then regular monthly dues. In exchange for this, the club guaranteed them what every Roman craved: a decent, respectable funeral and a permanent resting place. It was a brilliant solution to the single greatest anxiety of the common Roman. For the price of a few glasses of wine a month, you bought peace of mind. These clubs were everywhere, and they were organized around every imaginable profession or shared identity. There was the Collegium for the Guild of Carpenters, the Society for the Grain Merchants at Ostia, the Club for the city's firefighters. There were clubs for freedmen, clubs organized around the worship of a particular deity like Isis or Mithras, and even clubs for slaves who, with their master's permission, could pay their dues for the promise of a dignified end. The inner workings of a collegium are fascinating because they feel so incredibly modern. They had statutes, written rules that every member had to abide by. Surviving inscriptions from these clubs lay it all out. They list the entry fee, perhaps 100 sesterces, and the monthly dues, maybe 5 arses a month. They detail the benefits. Upon a member's death, the club would grant a fixed sum, say 300 sesterces, to the family to cover the funeral expenses. This was called the funerati fee. This money ensured that a proper libertinarius could be hired, that there would be a procession, maybe a few flute players, and a proper cremation pyre. But the club's obligations didn't end with a cash payout. The real benefit, the thing that made the collegia so vital, was the promise of community. The club's rules stipulated that a certain number of members had to attend the funeral procession. You were guaranteed not to make that final journey alone. A delegation of your fellow club members, your friends and colleagues, would be there to walk with your family, to see you off. This was an immense social comfort. It meant that even if you had no family, or if your family was poor, you would still have a crowd of mourners. Your death would be witnessed. Your life would be honoured. Many of these collegia went a step further. They didn't just fund the funeral. They owned the tomb. They would pool their resources to buy a plot of land outside the city and construct a large communal tomb, a columbarium. The name means dovecote, because the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of small, square niches, just like the nesting boxes for doves. After a member was cremated, their ashes would be placed in a simple urn, often made of terracotta or glass, and this urn would be placed in one of the niches, a small marble plaque. A titulus would be fixed to the wall below, stating the person's name, their age, and perhaps a short, affectionate phrase: to Aurelia, sweetest wife; to Marcus, best of friends. Walking into a Roman columbarium today is an incredibly moving experience. You are surrounded by the quiet, orderly presence of thousands of ordinary people, not famous generals or emperors, but bakers, weavers, clerks, and former slaves. Each little plaque is a testament to a life lived and to a community that promised not to let that life be forgotten. The collegia were a triumph of social organization, a grassroots movement against oblivion. They also functioned as lively social clubs in the present. The rules often specified mandatory dinners on certain holidays or on the anniversary of the club's founding. Fines were levied for members who started fights or spoke out of turn during meetings. They were little self-governing democracies with elected officers, a quaestor to manage the money, magistry to preside over the dinners. They provided a sense of belonging and mutual support in the chaotic, often anonymous world of a giant city like Rome. They were a testament to the fact that while the wealthy could buy their immortality individually, the common people could achieve it together. This entire ecosystem of services and societies, from the high-end funeral director to the humble burial club, drove a massive and diverse economy. The demand for the physical goods of death was relentless. Let's start with the most expensive item on the list, the sarcophagus. Cremation was the most common practice for much of Roman history, but by the 2nd century AD, inhumation burial of the intact body became increasingly fashionable, especially among the wealthy. This trend created a huge market for sarcophagi. These weren't just stone boxes, they were works of art, commissioned and carved by highly skilled artisans. The most prestigious workshops were in Rome itself, or in Athens, or in Asia Minor. They worked with different kinds of stone, each with its own price point and prestige. Local limestone was the budget option, but for the truly wealthy, only imported marble would do. White marble was shipped from the quarries at Carrara in Italy, or from the Greek islands. Its fine grain was perfect for carving the incredibly intricate scenes that covered the sides of these coffins. The subject matter of these carvings tells us so much about Roman beliefs. They weren't usually somber or sad. Instead, they depicted vibrant mythological scenes, the triumphs of Dionysus, the god of wine and rebirth, the hunt for the Caledonian boar, a symbol of courage, or scenes from the lives of the Muses, representing culture and learning. These weren't scenes about death, they were allegories about the virtues of the deceased and the hope for a happy afterlife. A general might have a sarcophagus covered in scenes of battle. A scholar might have one depicting philosophers. Each was a personalized statement, a final, fantastically expensive branding exercise. And then there was the Rolls-Royce of materials, porphyry. This was a deep purple, incredibly hard stone quarried from a single remote mountain in the Egyptian desert, the Mons Porphyrites. The quarries were imperial monopolies. Only the emperor and his immediate family could use porphyry. To be buried in a porphyry sarcophagus was the ultimate, unambiguous statement of power and divinity. The logistics of getting a multi-ton block of this stone from a remote desert mountain, down the Nile, across the Mediterranean, and into a Roman workshop were staggering. The cost was astronomical. It was the material of eternity. For the far greater number of people who were cremated, or who couldn't afford a sarcophagus, there was still a huge industry for memorial markers. The roads leading out of any Roman city, like the Appian Way outside Rome, were lined for miles with tombs. This was because Roman law, for reasons of sanitation and religious tradition, forbade burial within the city's sacred boundary, the Pomerium, the necropolis. The city of the dead was a sprawling, chaotic and competitive suburb that mirrored the city of the living. Here you would find the workshops of the stonemasons, churning out a vast array of funeral altars, tombstones. The most common type of inscription began with the letters D.M. for dis manibus, to the spirit gods of the departed. This was followed by the name of the person, their age at death, and who had set up the monument: a loving wife, a dutiful son, a grateful freedman. Some of these memorials were simple and touching. Others were elaborate, featuring a carved portrait bust of the deceased, looking out at the passerby with that uniquely Roman, hyper-realistic gaze. And some tombs were designed to look like miniature houses or temples. One of the most famous tombs on the Appian Way is that of a baker, Eurysaces. He had his tomb built in the shape of a giant industrial bread oven, with friezes around the top showing every stage of the baking process: grinding the grain, kneading the dough, forming the loaves, and putting them in the oven. It is a proud, joyful monument to a life of hard work. He wasn't a senator or a general, but he wanted every single person who walked past his tomb for the next 2,000 years to know that he was a master baker, and he was damned good at his job. Every part of this industry required raw materials and specialized labor. The quarries buzzed with the sound of hammers and saws, freeing the stone from the earth. The ports were busy with ships unloading marble from Greece and granite from Egypt. The workshops in the cities were filled with the fine dust of stonemasonry, as artisans patiently carved out an inscription or brought a portrait to life with a drill and chisel. And that's just the stone. Think of the other industries. The textile workers weaving the linen shrouds and the expensive purple-dyed wool for the funeral couch. The perfumers of Capua, mixing the costly oils and incense, frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Somalia, that were essential both for anointing the body and for throwing onto the cremation pyre to mask the smell of burning flesh and to please the gods. The carpenters building the coffins and the pyres themselves. The metalworkers forging the lead boxes sometimes used for ashes. The glassblowers creating the delicate, iridescent vials for perfumes, and the beautiful blue and green urns that would hold the final remains. The potters, making hundreds of thousands of simple, cheap terracotta urns for the niches of the columbaria. The economy of death was a complex web that touched almost every part of Roman commerce. It was driven by a deep-seated cultural imperative, but it was executed with a practical, business-like efficiency. The Libertinarius was not some ghoulish figure lurking in the shadows. He was a businessman, a service provider who understood his market. He knew that his clients were driven by a cocktail of grief, social pressure, and spiritual fear, and he offered a product to soothe all three. There was, of course, a dark side to all of this. With so much money changing hands at a time of emotional vulnerability, the potential for exploitation was huge. Moralists like the satirist Juvenal complained about the obscene cost of funerals, where families would bankrupt themselves to put on a good show. He sneered at the dry-eyed grief of the hired mourners and the empty pomp of it all. There was a persistent social stigma against those who profited from death. The libertinari, the pollunctors, even the musicians who played at funerals, were all considered to belong to professions of ill repute. They were barred from holding public office. They were ritually unclean, necessary but marginal figures in a society obsessed with purity and status. Yet their industry was the bedrock that supported Rome's entire relationship with the dead. Without the Undertaker's ledger, without the price lists and the service packages, the grand rituals would have been impossible. Without the burial clubs, the promise of a dignified end would have been a hollow dream for millions of ordinary citizens. This vast industry, from the quarrying of a mountain of porphyry for an emperor to the monthly payment of a few coins to a burial club by a shoemaker, was all aimed at one single goal: to push back against the terrifying tide of oblivion, to ensure that when a person's voice fell silent, their name would not. The tombstone, the sarcophagus, the little plaque in the columbarium, they were all anchors cast into the future, designed to hold a memory fast against the currents of time. The Romans knew that life was fleeting, but they believed, with a fierce and pragmatic determination, that a good death, properly managed and properly paid for, could be the beginning of a kind of permanence. It was a final, and perhaps the most important investment they would ever make. Chapter 7. The Unremembered. Death beyond the elite. But what of the ones who couldn't make that investment? For every senator with a grand mausoleum, for every wealthy merchant with a family tomb that was more of a small palace, there were 1,000 others for whom death was not a managed transition into memory, but a sudden, messy and anonymous end. We've walked the Appian Way and admired the grand real estate of the afterlife. We've seen how the Roman elite fought a desperate, expensive, and sometimes beautiful war against oblivion. Now we must turn away from those floodlit monuments and look into the shadows. We must ask the uncomfortable question that lurks behind every great civilization: what happens to everyone else? What happens when you can't afford the marble, the plot of land, the professional mourners, or even the wood for a proper pyre? What was the final investment for those who had nothing to invest? The answer, for a vast number of people in Rome, was as unsentimental as it was practical. It was a descent into a place known by a deceptively gentle name: the Puticuli, the little pits. This is a masterpiece of Roman understatement. These were not little pits. They were vast, open, communal graves, yawning chasms dug into the earth just outside the city's formal boundary, the Pomerium. For centuries, the most infamous of these were located on the Esquiline Hill, which, before it was famously gentrified by the wealthy patron Maecenas in the age of Augustus, was less of a desirable neighbourhood and more of a municipal nightmare. It was Rome's dumping ground, a place of foul air, circling birds, and the grim business of the city's underbelly. Here, Death was stripped of all its poetry. There were no processions, no eulogies, no soul-catching last breaths. Here, death was a sanitation problem. The bodies of the destitute, of slaves whose owners didn't care to provide for them, of executed criminals, and of victims of the plagues that periodically scoured the city's crowded tenements, they all ended up here. Imagine the scene. A rickety cart, pulled by a mule, creaks its way out of the city gates at night. It's piled high with the day's dead, collected by the libertinari, the undertakers who handled the grim logistics of the city's poorest. These weren't the high-end funeral directors we've discussed before. These were the men who did the dirty work. The bodies on the cart are unwashed, unclothed, already beginning the work of decay in the Mediterranean heat. There is no dignity here. There is only weight and mass. The cart arrives at the edge of a meticulously, and the bodies are simply tipped in. Unceremoniously, they tumble down among the hundreds, the thousands that have come before them. There are no markers, no names, no sense of individuality, a person's entire existence, their loves, their fears, their small triumphs, their quiet sorrows, is erased in that final gravitational pull. They become part of an anonymous geology of human remains. The smell, we are told by writers like Horace, was indescribable, a permanent miasma of decay that hung over the entire district, a constant sickening reminder of the city's mortality. It was a public health crisis, and a spiritual one. For the Romans, an unburied or improperly buried body was a source of profound dread. The soul, the manes, could not find its way to the underworld. It would be trapped, becoming a restless, malevolent ghost, a lemur to haunt the living. So these pits were not just a sign of callousness, they were a containment strategy, a way to quarantine the dead, to keep their potential ghostly pollution away from the heart of the city. But in doing so, they created a landscape of pure horror, a place where you could literally see the foundations of Roman society, built upon the bones of its forgotten. Archaeologists excavating the area in the 19th century found strata of bone and black, decomposed organic matter up to 10 meters deep, tens of thousands of individuals, compressed by time and pressure into a single, undifferentiated mass. If you've ever worried about being forgotten after you're gone, take a moment. The Roman poor had a much more immediate and visceral fear, not just of being forgotten, but of being dissolved, of having their very physical form merged into a collective so vast that it rendered their individual life meaningless. The grand tombs of the elite were a desperate shout into the void. I was here. The meticulously were the void's silent, patient answer. And yet, even within this stark divide between the remembered and the erased, Roman society had its complexities. Not everyone who died outside the traditional family structure was simply thrown away. There were other paths, other rituals for those whose deaths broke the mold. Consider the Roman soldier. He was the backbone of the empire, the instrument of its expansion, and the guarantor of its peace. But he often died hundreds, if not thousands of miles from his ancestral home, on a windswept hill in Britannia, a dusty plain in Parthia, or a dense forest in Germania. There was no question of shipping his body back to Italy for a family funeral. The logistics were impossible. Did that mean he was forgotten? Absolutely not. For the soldier, the legion was his family. His comrades were his brothers, and they had their own powerful, pragmatic rites. When a soldier fell in battle, his comrades would, if the tactical situation allowed, retrieve his body. A pyre would be constructed on the spot. It wouldn't be the elegant, perfumed pyre of a Roman aristocrat. It would be a rough, functional thing, built from whatever was at hand: broken wagon wheels, discarded shields, the shafts of spears. His fellow soldiers would gather around. His commanding officer would give a eulogy. But it wouldn't be about his family lineage or his wealth. It would be about his virtus, his courage, his strength, his loyalty to the eagle standard, and to the men who stood beside him. His ashes would be collected and placed in a simple urn, perhaps just a standard-issue army pot. This would then be buried near the camp, or at a military cemetery that grew over time at the legion's permanent fortress. A simple marker, a stello, might be erected, carved by a fellow soldier who knew a bit of stonework. The inscription would be brutally efficient. His name, his legion, his rank, his years of service. Gaius Valerius Crispus, legionary of the Knights Hispana, served 18 years, fell here. It was a funeral service stripped down to its essential military core: identity, service, honor. His memory was entrusted not to his biological family, but to the institutional memory of the Roman army. He was a part of something larger than himself, and in death, he was reabsorbed into it. Sometimes, if his family back home had the means, they would erect a cenotaph for him, an empty tomb. They would perform all the rites, say all the prayers, make all the offerings, to a grave that contained no body. It was a symbolic marker, a placeholder for their grief, a way to anchor his wandering spirit to his home soil, even if his ashes lay beneath a foreign sky. It was a poignant admission of the Empire's vastness, a long-distance funeral call to a son who would never return. From the anonymous pit and the soldier's lonely pyre, we can swing to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, to a death so significant, so public, and so politically charged that it ceased to be a funeral at all and became a piece of state theatre. I'm talking about the death of an emperor, specifically, a good emperor. When a beloved emperor died, or one who the new emperor wanted to portray as beloved, he wasn't just buried, he was deified. His funeral was a ceremony called an apotheosis, which literally means to become a god. Death wasn't an end, it was a promotion. This was the most lavish and bizarre ritual in the entire Roman funerary playbook. The whole process was a carefully managed public relations campaign, designed to ensure a smooth transition of power, and to retroactively bless the previous reign with a stamp of divine approval. First, the emperor's actual body would be prepared and cremated in a relatively private ceremony, but for the public, a life-sized effigy of the emperor was created out of wax, crafted to look as if he were merely sleeping. This wax figure, dressed in triumphal robes, would be placed on a magnificent ivory couch in the imperial palace. For 7 days it would lie in state. The great and the good of Rome would file past. A team of physicians would even come each day to examine the patient, solemnly announcing that he was, alas, getting weaker and weaker. It was a piece of carefully orchestrated political fiction, allowing the city and the empire to process the death in slow motion. On the final day, the grand procession began. The wax effigy was carried from the palace, through the Forum, and out to the Campus Martius, the same field where Romulus was said to have ascended to the heavens. The procession was a who's who of Roman power: senators, magistrates, priests, and the imperial family, all marching in solemn order. Actors wearing masks representing the emperor's great ancestors also marched, creating a ghostly lineage that stretched back through time. It was as if all of Roman history was converging to witness this one moment. In the Campus Martius, a spectacular funeral pyre had been built, and I don't mean a simple stack of wood. This was a multi-story architectural marvel, a tower made of fragrant resinous timbers, covered in gold-embroidered tapestries, intricate ivory carvings, and paintings of mythological scenes. It looked less like a pyre, and more like a temporary palace designed to be set ablaze. The effigy was placed reverently in a chamber on the 2nd story, and then came the climax. The new emperor, the designated heir, would step forward and with a torch light the pyre. As the colossal structure began to burn, with flames leaping hundreds of feet into the air, a final, critical act took place. At the very moment the pyre was fully engulfed, a cage, hidden at the very top, would be opened, and from the inferno an eagle would be released, soaring up into the sky. The symbolism was unmistakable to every Roman watching. The eagle, the bird of Jupiter, was carrying the emperor's soul directly to the heavens to take its place among the gods. The Senate would then formally vote to recognize his new divine status. He was now Divus Augustus, or Divus Vespasianus. A new god had been minted. Temples would be built in his honor, priests appointed to his cult. Objecting to his policies now carried the very real risk of being charged with blasphemy. It was the ultimate consolidation of power, turning a political legacy into a religious fact. Between the stark anonymity of the pits and the cosmic spectacle of apotheosis, there was another category of death that Romans struggled with, one that didn't fit their neat categories of honor and memory: the death of a child. In a world with staggering infant mortality, where perhaps half of all children did not live to see their 10th birthday, Roman society had to develop a certain level of emotional armor. The death of an infant, particularly a newborn, was often treated with a quiet, sorrowful pragmatism. Roman law and custom dictated that a child who died within the first 40 days of life, before they had been formally named, was not eligible for a full funeral rite. There was no procession, no pyre. These infants were often buried, not cremated, in a practice known as shugrundarium. They would be placed in the earth in a simple grave, sometimes right under the eaves of the family home, as if to keep them close. It was a quiet, private grief, deemed too small and too common for public ceremony. Even for older children, the rites were often muted. The procession would take place at night, by torchlight, to signify a life cut short before its noon. The traditional wailing of the mourners was considered inappropriate. It was an inversion of the natural order, a sorrow that was meant to be borne with a stoic and heavy silence. But beneath these societal norms, the raw personal pain of parents is heartbreakingly clear. All you have to do is read the tombstones. While the official rites might have been curtailed, families poured their grief and their love into these small memorials. The inscriptions for children are some of the most moving artifacts from the Roman world. You find epitaphs filled with diminutives and terms of endearment. To my sweetest daughter, our little darling, the most clever boy. They often list the child's age with a painful precision, as if trying to hold on to every last moment. Lived 6 years, 2 months, 9 days, and 4 hours. One famous epitaph for a little girl reads, "Here I lie, a wretched girl, in the darkness of the tomb, snatched away in my 7th year from the sweet light of life. Traveller, if you have any human feeling, do not desecrate this little mound with your feet." Another, for a boy named Magnus, simply says, "He was everything to his parents." These small stones are a testament to a love that defied social convention. They show us that no amount of cultural conditioning or philosophical stoicism could truly numb the pain of losing a child. In these inscriptions, we see the official Roman persona crack, revealing the universal, timeless grief of a parent. They couldn't give their child a long life, but they could give them this, a name carved in stone, a final desperate act of remembrance against a world that expected them to move on quietly. All of these practices, from the industrial disposal of the poor to the deification of the emperor, were part of a complex system, a distinctly Roman way of understanding the boundary between life and death. It was a system built on cremation, on public memory, and on the importance of the family and the state. But this entire worldview, which had stood for 1,000 years, was about to face a profound challenge. A quiet revolution was beginning, not in the Senate or on the battlefield, but in the minds and souls of ordinary people. It began with the so-called mystery cults that trickled into Rome from the eastern provinces, cults dedicated to figures like Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, or Cybele from Anatolia. These religions offered something that the formal, transactional Roman state religion did not: a personal relationship with the deity, and crucially, the promise of a blessed afterlife. The focus was no longer on being remembered on earth by your descendants. The goal was salvation. The goal was to ensure your individual soul, your psyche, would have a happy existence in the next world through initiation and devotion. This was a seismic shift. It reframed death, not as a problem of memory to be solved with a tombstone, but as a spiritual transition to be navigated with faith. And these new beliefs brought with them new funerary practices. Many of these cults, particularly those from Egypt, favored burial inhumation over cremation. The body was seen as important, something to be preserved for a future resurrection or transformation. This idea began to slowly take root in Roman society, even among those who weren't initiates. We start to see a gradual but definite trend away from cremation and towards burial, with the wealthy now opting for elaborate carved sarcophagi instead of cremation urns. And then came the faith that would take all these simmering ideas and forge them into a new world order: Christianity. For early Christians, the body was not a temporary vessel to be discarded. It was the temple of the Holy Spirit. And most importantly, it was promised a physical resurrection on the day of judgment, just as Christ himself had been resurrected. This theological belief made cremation almost unthinkable. To burn the body was to seem to preempt God's final miracle. Inhumation became a profound statement of faith. But Christian burial wasn't just about the individual's body, it was about community. One of the radical appeals of early Christianity was its disregard for the social hierarchies that defined Roman life. In Christ, they believed, there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. This egalitarian ideal extended to death. The goal wasn't to be buried in a grand family plot that advertised your status. The goal was to be buried among your brothers and sisters in faith, awaiting the resurrection together. This led to the creation of a new kind of cemetery, the catacombs. It's a common myth that the catacombs were secret hiding places where Christians lived to escape persecution. They weren't. They were simply cemeteries, large, underground burial grounds, dug into the soft volcanic tufa rock outside the city walls. They were necessary because this new, rapidly growing community needed a lot of space to bury their dead, and land was expensive. Going down was the most practical solution. To enter a catacomb is to step into a different world. You leave the bright, noisy Roman world behind and descend into a silent, cool labyrinthine darkness. The air is damp and smells of earth. Narrow corridors twist and turn, lit only by the small clay lamps of visitors. The walls are honeycombed with simple rectangular niches called loculi, stacked one on top of the other like shelves. Each loculus held a body, wrapped in a simple linen shroud. The niche was then sealed with a marble slab or terracotta tiles, with the deceased's name, and perhaps a simple Christian symbol, scratched into the wet plaster. Peace be with you, Aurelia. Victor, in peace. It is a world of humbling simplicity. There are no grand monuments here. Everyone is equal in the darkness. A wealthy Christian might be buried in a larger arched tomb called an arcosolium, which might be decorated with a fresco, but they are still there, in the same corridor, alongside the poorest members of their church. The community of faith held true, even in death. And the art on the walls tells the story of this profound shift in worldview. Roman tombs were decorated with scenes from the deceased's life, their military victories, their banquets, their family portraits. It was all about their past accomplishments. The art of the catacombs is all about the future, its art of hope and salvation. You see images of Jonah being spat out by the great fish, a symbol of resurrection. You see Daniel in the lion's den, saved by his faith. You see Moses striking the rock for water, symbolizing baptism. And most common of all, you see the image of the Good Shepherd, a gentle, beardless youth with a lamb across his shoulders, a symbol of Christ saving the individual soul. There are almost no images of the crucifixion, of suffering, or of judgment. The art is overwhelmingly optimistic. It is a quiet, confident declaration that death has been defeated. Here, in the cool, silent darkness of the catacombs, the long story of the Roman funeral comes to an end, and a new one begins. The 1,000-year-old obsession with earthly memory, with anchoring a name to a place, finally gives way to a new obsession, the promise of a heavenly future. The final, most important investment was no longer in a monument of stone on the Appian Way. It was in a promise of salvation, shared with a community of believers in the quiet earth below. The Roman world was not just burying its dead, it was burying itself, and from that rich soil, a new world was already beginning to grow.